Hello, I'm Bob the Booker and welcome to my channel. And as some of you may know, if you follow the channel for a little bit, the whole channel was started 5 years ago, almost exactly now, as a way for me to kind of keep myself accountable while I did a project that was about reading all of the old Booker Prize shortlists from right back to 1969 when it all started till now. And as part of that, I've been plugging away and reading these shortlists. I'm not that far away. I think 15 books total roughly, I think, are left now, which is wild. But that has recently meant that as I'm doing that, I've been sort of essentially completing years, which I'm still doing. I'm still sort of uploading videos of the years bit by bit as I go. But I am now in the nice position where I finished, well, completed, again, feels like the wrong word, but the shortlists for the whole of the 2000s. And so this is me attempting to pick my favourites out of the 2000s. I will add at this point, there were long lists during this time, and particularly 2007, it switched to the 13 book long list that we know now. I've not yet subjected myself to the to going and reading all of the long lists from those times. So there may be some really brilliant books from those times that I am not aware of as yet. But this is me attempting to read the books from those shortlists. Another thing I want to add at this point is this is before the prize moved to allowing books from all across the world. So this is still when the prize is just the Commonwealth, essentially. And so as a result, we see a lot more, the prize tends to feature a lot more British, Irish, and Canadian especially authors. You do have authors from a lot of other parts of the world and of the Commonwealth, but it's mostly from those countries. So if the books I'm talking about seem like a very limited pool of authors, that's kind of why. Most of the books I've got on here are by British, Irish and Canadian authors. And actually there weren't a ton of people from other places mentioned in it. So yeah, you'll see as I go when I talk about them. I was tempted to, well, I tried originally to do this as 10 books. I couldn't decide between a couple of my favourites, and so it became 12, which is what often happens. I try and attempt a 10 and it always becomes a 12. And I was also thinking to myself that I wanted to do only one book per author, but you'll see at one point where I gave up on that. It's only with one author, but it was a tricky thing otherwise for me. So with that, all of that preamble in mind, let's go talking about these books. I'll try and keep it short and sweet because we have 12 books to talk about. But I think what's really striking from a lot of these is just how wonderful some of these shortlists are. Particularly when it comes to 2005, I almost just listed the whole shortlist. But I had to be selective. I've also left out the winners because I think in some ways that complicates matters. I wanted to focus on the books that didn't win, that I still think are excellent in their own way. All of that preamble aside, let's get going talking about the books. So first up, an honourable mention here. I almost put in When We Were Orphans by Kazuo Ishiguro from 2000 here. I eventually had to cut it, but it's kind of an honourable mention because I love this book and I think it's a bit of an underrated one in Ishiguro's oeuvre, I guess. But starting with 2001, and a book that in some ways needs no introduction because it's sold by the bucket load, and I think for many people they see it as one of McEwan's finest works. I think it's one of his best as well, and it seems so strange looking back that this didn't win, because I think it has such a, it's just gone on to have this much bigger life. There's been a film adaptation, there've been all these other things. Atonement by Ian McEwan. This is a book that is set in the 1930s, at least at the beginning part of the book, and a hot, sticky night in a giant house. And we have a few characters going around. Mostly we're told the story through the eyes of a young girl. And she witnesses something happening. I'm trying to avoid the spoiler here because this book hinges on a lot of twists and turns. She sees something and she is convinced something more dangerous perhaps has happened. She's watched two people trying to essentially kiss or maybe have sex, and she's convinced that something much bigger is happening. This all sets off a chain of events, and particularly this is just before World War II. So what we start to see is how his life is radically affected by what she has said, and the way that this family then falls apart or has various changes happen to them because of this one moment. And the idea of this title of Atonement is around that, of how do we atone for what we've said or done. And I don't want to spoil anything more, because I think this book then does so many other fascinating things with twists and turns. I reread this book. So I originally read it when I was 17 or so, and I reread it a couple of years ago as part of this project. And I was so surprised by how tense and twisty it still feels, even though I kind of know what's about to happen. Without spoiling anything, the way this book builds towards a dramatic end, I just think is so exceptionally handled. And this feels like McEwan at his best, where he's so in control of the narrative in a really almost frightening way. It's so well crafted, and I think this is a phenomenal piece of writing. And particularly, I remember hearing an interview with Ian McEwan where he was nervous when he sent this manuscript to his publishers, because he thought this is just not sellable, it's not going to work. And his publishers basically came back and said, it's a twisty turny book that features World War II and a love story, like, you're fine. I think this is a really exceptional piece of writing, and I personally prefer it to the winner from that year, The True History of the Kelly Gang, even though there's a lot about that book I like. But I think this is just such a towering achievement of a novel. Next up, we go to 2002, and this is Unless by Carol Shields. I fell in love with this book. I just think it's so brilliantly crafted. The core idea is that a mother has lost contact with her daughter and is spending the novel trying to understand what might have happened to her. She goes wandering in hopes that she might see her. She tries to think about how she might be able to engage with her. And it becomes very clear as the novel goes on that there's a breakdown in communication, a breakdown in understanding, and so many other things. But we are told this all through her perspective in this way that's really, it's such a weighty book in terms of how complex that feeling is of trying to repair a loss that is existing for this mother. But then I think it really unravels in these really clever and interesting ways. And again, without spoiling anything, I just think it's so beautifully crafted. The thing that then I find also really interesting on top of that is the title Unless comes into play with something else that's going on in the book, where all the chapter titles are essentially adverbs or grammatical particles in some way. And so there's this sense of what can't be said, because it feels like we're starting each chapter almost as a sentence of, well, unless, already, perhaps, these sorts of things that just feel so fleeting, and like we can't quite grasp what's happening. And that ties in so beautifully with the story about this lack of ability to communicate. And I just think it's a phenomenally written piece of writing that really personally affected me, and I thought was just beautiful. Staying in 2002, we also have William Trevor with The Story of Lucy Gault. And I think this is a phenomenal piece of writing. This is a very quiet novel. It's a lot about a young woman called Lucy who, in the midst of a lot of chaos, runs away, and it sets off a lot of other things happening in the story. But for me, the way this book is crafted is just so gorgeous. If you've not read anything by William Trevor before, I really highly recommend him. I, at one point, did a bit of a deep dive of all of his shortlisted books from the Booker. And the thing that was so interesting for me with seeing all of them side by side is just the tenderness and care that goes into his writing. Not a word feels out of place. There are moments where significant moments happen in 2 sentences, and that's all that needs to be done. The silence of the books fills a lot of the meaning as well. And in Lucy Gault, it's just so tenderly done, where we watch this young girl and the ways that people around her react. She is this young girl, and is innocent and is sort of thinking about various things in her life and is trying to make sense of it. at the same time, the people around her, we get a sense of how they are trying to react to the news. And it is so beautiful. It's a really quiet, pensive book. And it's only about 250 pages or so, but it feels like it has this whole sort of epic within it. Just because of the ways that we are inside the heads of the characters. So yeah, I think this is sublime. This was one of the books when I was reading this year, the shortlist for this year, that I just was blown away by how quiet and tender this book is, and how it really grasps at the sense of meaning for what it means to kind of try and find a sense of self, or what it means to have community and try and care about community. I just think it's wonderful. Now we go on to 2003, and from a quiet book in Lucy Gault to a book that's a little bit more maximalist and fabulous in many ways. Sarah Waters with Fingersmith. I loved this. Sarah Waters was an author who I'd known about for ages, and I think up until either last year or the year before, I hadn't read anything by her. I'd had this book basically since it came out in paperback, and it sat on my shelves for about 20 years. And I finally got around to it, and I am so blown away by this. It is set in a sort of Victorian England. It has a kind of steampunk feel at times, but it's Victorian England, largely focused on somebody who works as a fingersmith, essentially is a thief. And there is a love story that starts off between them and somebody of a higher class. And although that sounds initially like a very trope-laden type of story, this book constantly subverts everything that you think might be going on. There is at one point a giant twist in this book, which I accidentally spoiled for myself by seeing Portrait of a Lady on Fire, I think it's called, the film that essentially takes the inspiration from this story. That said, the twist is still jaw-dropping when you get to it. It is a book that is deeply sensual and sexual and sexy. It is a book that is funny and witty and joyous. It is dark. It focuses a lot on power imbalances and those sorts of dynamics. It does so much, and I just think it's wonderful. And it's a longer book, but it's one of those books that I think really earns every page. It is gripping. It is funny. I love this. I think Sarah Waters just absolutely knocked it out of the park. And she's written a fair few other books that were also shortlisted for the Booker. This is still a personal favourite, but I think she's sublime. She's such a great writer. And, you know, Fingersmith was one of those books that really got out there, and I think found a lot of fans as well. Next up, a book that is very different from the ones I've mentioned before. This is still in 2003, Monica Ali with Brick Lane. And I think a TV show or a TV adaptation or a film has been made of this. I think a TV adaptation. But this is a story about a young woman called Nazneen, and she moves from Bangladesh to London. She's told that this will be the start of a new life where she will be married, and so many other things will happen for her. And she lives in Brick Lane in London, which is an area with a really proud and vibrant Bangladeshi population. And she at first feels, quite excited, although sort of feels some trepidation about this. But soon as the book unravels, we feel that things aren't quite right in a few ways. Essentially, she is incredibly vulnerable in many ways. She does not at this time speak a great deal of English, and she's quite vulnerable in the sense that she is, if she leaves the area of Brick Lane, or if she leaves a sort of predominantly Bangladeshi area, she does not really know how to function. We soon realise that she's in quite an abusive or quite a controlling relationship. And there's also something that sparks up in this novel as well, where she starts becoming a lot closer to somebody who is quite radical and who seems to be potentially involved in either a terrorist plot or in some kind of radicalization. And this then means that she is trapped between worlds in this incredibly vulnerable position where she kind of can't speak up or can't really do a great deal. And there's something so suffocating about the atmosphere of this book. And I thought this was really, really well done. It is one of those books that's almost continued to feel more and more urgent and prescient as years have gone on, particularly with any kind of news case of somebody who has been either trafficked or has been brought to the UK and has lived in a very vulnerable position. This book, I think, continues to really speak to the difficulty of that position, and particularly how governments and various other things don't help matters with that. I think this is it's a really tough read at times, but a really essential one. And I think just Monica Ali, I think, absolutely wrote her socks off with this book. I think it's such a brilliant piece of thrilling and dark and tricky writing. There's a lot of nuance in this book that could go so horribly wrong, and I think she keeps it really well together. Next up, I couldn't not have this one in because it's such a personal favourite of mine. Also in 2003, I realise this year's getting a lot of love. Zoe Heller with Notes on a Scandal, and part of this I might be partly influenced by the fact that there's a film version that features Cate Blanchett and Judi Dench. That may be swaying it, but I think the book itself is incredibly well done. And in interviews with her, you can see with Zoe Heller, you can see how the ways that she's crafted this book really added to what I think is its main success. So it is the story of it's told largely through the perspective of an older woman who works in a school, and a younger woman starts at this school, and she immediately starts to she tries to become quite good friends with her, but there's a feeling of menace and of threat. And because we are having this perspective through this woman, this older woman, we start to see the bitterness and jealousy and fury that comes through. It's very poisonous in the way that it's done at times, where she'll comment on how she looks and the things that she says and does. And there's a real menace to the interactions that go on in this book. And particularly when when the younger teacher, the newer teacher, seems to start developing some kind of relationship with a student who is in his, I think he's sort of maybe 16, 17, 18. This is when the older woman starts to almost plan her downfall. And there is something about the way this is written that is so fantastic, I think, because it's done with this real... It's deeply uncomfortable, but also very barbed and acidic in a way that's very funny. And because of this woman is from a different generation, the way she writes and sees what's happening is done with such a delicate sense of touch. And so it's brilliant because, she'll describe, instead of describing someone as larger, she'll describe them as Pantagruelian, and she just has this real fire and wit to her. But it is terrifying knowing that this book is building towards something that might be less savory. It is jaw-dropping in the way that it does it, and I think this is fantastic, and I have such love for this book. I think it's so well done. I think it's a real class act. So we finally move out of 2003. I could have almost added more, but there we go. And 2004 with Gerard, Woodward, and I'll Go to Bed at Noon. And this is the second part of a trilogy. And I really enjoyed the trilogy as a whole. I read them after this book because I loved it so much. But this book works very well as a standalone. I read this first and it worked. Essentially, we have a family who are in many ways very dysfunctional, whilst also having a veneer of functional sort of to the outside world. They seem to have, in many ways, a lot of their lives together, but there is an alcohol problem at the heart of this family that is tearing things apart. There are various other things that just don't work. It's just a bit of a mess and a bit complicated. But what we see in the midst of this is just a very quietly confident book that details everything that's going on with this family. We start to see the very tragic downfall. We start to see the ways that they try to bring it back in this sense of hope that things might be okay again. We start to then see how that maybe isn't going to be okay again. This book just really follows this family in such tight focus. And it's so quietly done. It's very observant. It feels like the author is one of the characters sat on the end, like on the end of the sofa, watching this all play out and trying to make sense of this dysfunctional family around them. It's quite funny at times. It's a really, it has these moments of silliness and absurdity, but it is also just so tightly focused on this drama and this chaos, but also the ways that that's hidden under this middle class veneer of respectability, and how, you know, there's a resistance to being middle class by becoming a Marxist, but then that still is done in a very middle class way, and all these things happening. It's wonderful, and I just, it was such a gem to find while I was doing this project, because it's just a book that I had not heard of at all otherwise, and I think is a brilliant piece of writing. Next up, we have Kazuo Ishiguro with Never Let Me Go from 2005. And this is a book that I just think is phenomenal in so many ways. It hinges quite a lot on a big twist. And it's a twist that in some ways, as you read the book for the first time, you don't see coming at all, but also have some suspicions of. And it's a book that builds very subtly as it goes. It's largely around a group of friends who are recounting their days from when they used to go to a school together. And they had all of these interpersonal relationships, you know, crushes, fallouts, all those kinds of things. And yet when they're recounting their history of having all been together, little things start to not really make sense, or they suddenly start to question certain things. And it's a book that then really brings up this idea of what does it mean to feel things, to experience things, to be human. And it throws up all of these ideas, and I think delivers it with this really fascinating sort of story that feels at times very sci-fi, but very human and very grounded in other fiction. It's really interesting. And I think there's a real floor drop moment when I think this book lands the punch of what is maybe going on that is utterly terrifying. There's also a very, I mean, I say very good, I remember it being good, it was many years ago, film version of this with a really good soundtrack. But it's a book that I just think is really brilliant. And I think Ishiguro is just such a versatile author, and particularly when he comes up with something like this and Remains of the Day being by the same author is kind of fascinating for me. And I think this is just such a sublime piece of writing. Next up, staying in 2005, we have On Beauty by Zadie Smith. And it's a book that I worried at first that this was a real nostalgia thing, because I read it not long after it came out as part of a book club in my local library. And I remember then really liking it, finding its story of a kind of campus novel in the US, interesting for the way it explored various things. It looks at a lot around things around race and class and resources and privilege and many other things. It dabbles into a bit around political correctness and what have you, and it does so, I think, really interestingly. It also is a book that pokes a lot of fun at itself and doesn't always take itself that seriously. And I reread it a couple of years ago as part of this project, just to make sure that I wasn't completely on a nostalgia trip with this. And I think it really still held up for me personally. I think it's just so biting in the right ways at certain times. There's a really funny scene that I think about still quite a lot, where somebody goes along to a really bad poetry spoken word night and there's someone in the audience just watching as someone's like, my womb is a tomb, blah, blah, blah. And like this really like these grand statements with rhymes that when the characters try and unpick them later make no sense. And there's a lot that I found really funny about this book, whilst also there's something else going on that feels a lot more captivating as well. It has a serious edge to it. It has a point of view and somewhere that it's going, a sort of thesis statement, but it's quite happy to be fun and silly in the process as well. I think it's a really well done novel, and it just has a real confidence and punch to it that I think is brilliant. Keeping with 2005 for the last time, I promise, we have Ali Smith with The Accidental. And I, again, was worried about nostalgia with this and reread it a few years ago. It's also worth saying at this point, I love Ali Smith and I have read all of her novels. So I adore her. But this was the book that got me onto Ali Smith. And I think it's such a great showcase of her silliness and playfulness while delivering something quite weighty and tense. So there is a family story where this slightly dysfunctional family are all introduced to a woman who comes into their life. She is bold and brilliant and fascinating, and everyone in the family is in love with her in some kind of way. Some people actually fall in love with her or seem to at least have some kind of lust for her. The kids in the family are amazed at this person who is so unapologetic and is so counter to all the politeness and everything around her. She sort of marches in and establishes herself as part of this family. Everybody around her is sort of influenced by her in a way, almost with something like an Inspector Calls or a kind of story like that, or books by Deborah Levy, where she does this quite a lot as well, of having a character come in to this tense situation and to some degree amp up the tension but also resolve it. And she's just this mysterious floating creature essentially in this family, and I found it so entertaining and enjoyable. A friend of mine, she and I read it around the same time and were so in love with the wordplay in this that we just constantly reference little bits of it. There's a character called Amber, and there's a lot about traffic lights with that name, and it's just really silly and really funny. But in many ways feels like such an Ali Smith novel of this is a vehicle for telling this really interesting story about a family in many ways in free fall, but also just so silly and funny and playful and clever, and I just love it. I just think this is really enjoyable. I just love Ali Smith. I think this is such a great book. I so very nearly added in the other two books from 2005, which were Julian Barnes with Arthur and George, exceptional, really funny, really brilliant, and Sebastian Barry with A Long, Long Way, which is very beautifully done, completely poetic and just full of this real joy of language. Both of them essentially are also on this list. It's just I kind of had to cut for where I felt a personal touch with them, just because of how otherwise this video could have been just 2005 plus some others, really. So we moved now to 2007, and this is not to say that 2006 is bad. MJ Hyland's Carry Me Down was very, very nearly on this list. A very beautiful book told from the perspective of a young boy who is a sort of savant in some way and is not really understood by the world around him. 2007 also has Mohsin Hamid's The Reluctant Fundamentalist, which I think is really, really well done, but just got edged out when I was making the cut on these books. But the book that I do want to mention does involve a second go here for Ian McEwan, but it's my list. I get to choose the ones that personally work best for me. Ian McEwan is a very On Chesil Beach is a very slight, pensive book, but it builds to this moment of tension that is really, really beautifully managed, I think. It's a book about a couple who have just gotten married, and they are going on their honeymoon on Chesil Beach, hence the title of the book, and they are about to have sex for the first time, and this suddenly sets up the complicated part of this book. This is the 60s, and the values around this for them are slightly complicated. They suddenly realize when it comes to sex that they are perhaps not very well matched up. He is very, very keen for this to happen. She is worried about it and is finding that her whole body is sort of seizing up at the idea of it. And there's a suggestion in the book that for both of them there are a lot of shadows lingering for them that affect how they relate to each other and to sex and to many other things. And so this all goes horribly wrong in this very, very tense moment in the book. And then it expands outwards to what happens next. We see them a year later and their lives have changed quite radically. Florence, the woman in this relationship, has seen quite a lot of success. Edward has been mulling a lot on the idea of whether he could have a relationship with her that involved not sleeping with her. And it builds and builds with this sort of thought of what could be or what could have been. And then we fast forward to the future, where there's a looking back and a sense of regret, or again wondering what might have been. And I think this is where Ian McEwan for me is so often at his best, is just at this sense of regret, of a life moving on and looking back and thinking about what could have been different. And I think he does it so exceptionally in this novel, that yeah, as much as the winner that year, The Gathering by Anne Enright, I think is phenomenal. I would very happily have seen this book win as well, because I think it's just so slight and well crafted and tense in what it does, whilst just really it just has such a laser focus, such a tight focus on the characters and their inner lives in a way that is so beautifully done, I think. And last but not least, because otherwise I would add about 14 other books to this, we get to 2009. Again, not to say that 2008's bad. There just aren't as many books in that personally jump out for me as that I have a really core and beautiful relationship with in quite the same way. But 2009, where Wolf Hall takes the win, but very, very close to winning, is this book here, Summertime by J.M. Coetzee. And apparently it came down to a vote that was basically split, with 2 apiece for Summertime and Wolf Hall, and then a casting vote given for Wolf Hall. This book very nearly won, and I see why. It's the third part of a trilogy that is essentially a metafictional, autofictional kind of thing of J.M. Coetzee writing about his life. And so we see 2 books before this that talk about him as a younger man, and Summertime is him growing into where he is now. But this is done in this really odd way, because we basically start the book with J.M. Coetzee dead, being thought of by other people who were once in his life. And so we see people talk about J.M. Coetzee and his life and who he has been, and we see that in some ways people are really not flattering towards him about how he's been. There are quite a lot of things about his behavior, about how he has lived his life, who he's maybe hurt along the way, people who are maybe in love with him, all of these sorts of things. And so it feels really odd, because you're essentially reading a biography of an author who is meant to be dead, written by that real life author. And so there's a knowing wink throughout the book that this is doing something different and unusual, that it's essentially hinting at something else that might be going on, and is playing around with this idea of who really gets to tell the story of who you are. And I just love it. In fairness, again, Coetzee's one of those writers I could read almost anything by. I've adored so many of his books. This for me is a really sublime example of that, where I just think it's so clever in the way, even just the general idea of what the book is going to be, I think is very clever, but it's done so successfully, and it's really fun and interesting at times. It's also worth noting this would have been his 3rd win if he had won with this book. I do think the book deserves a win. Wolf Hall is obviously, it is brilliant in its own way as well. But yeah, it's a book I just have so much time for. I think it's so clever and experimental and joyful and clever, and I just love it. But yeah, that's that book. There we go. So those are the 12 books, with a few honourable mentions thrown in from the various shortlists over the years, particularly of the 2000s. There are lots of books I didn't mention here. If you think the whole decade would have had about 60 shortlisted books, 50 that would have been eligible for this, because I'm excluding the winners out of it. And so really getting it down to 12 is only really 1 in 4-ish. But at the same time, I think there are so many good books that were also here amongst these shortlists. So do check out the shortlist. Do check out these ones if they sound like they'd be of interest to you. But yeah, I just think the most fun thing for me of going back through this old project has been, there are a few big names here of authors who I already loved and maybe had read a bit at the time. So Ian McEwan, Ishiguro, Zadie Smith, Ali Smith, but also a few books that have crept in that I wouldn't otherwise have necessarily heard of, like the Gerard Woodward book. And it's so interesting for me to just see how many incredible books were coming out during the time. As well, if you look at the long lists for those years, so many big name authors were also there, including also Philip Pullman with The Amber Spyglass, who was longlisted for that book, I think in 2001, I want to say, early 2000s. And so you see all of these other fantastic books appearing in these lists as well. So do have a little look and check them out if they might be of interest. Thank you for joining me, talking more about the Booker Prize and the Booker Prize Shortlist project, which I can't believe is coming close to an end, at least in terms of my reading for it. Yeah, fun times. But thank you for joining me for this, and speak to you all soon. Bye bye.